Chapter 10. Stalled at Saria. At the same time that Menelik mobilized his army for the War of Independence, he deployed Alfred Ilg on a parallel mission, a public relations campaign in Europe. Ilg's task was to tell Ethiopia's story, but in a European voice. The polyglot Swiss gave interviews in all the major European languages. In fact, he talked to anyone who would listen. Above all, Ilg wanted to humanize the Ethiopians, a critical step in building sympathy for Ethiopia in the war and for marginalizing Italy. Ilg was pitiless in his criticism of Italy, and he invited Europeans to identify with the cause of Ethiopian liberty. He denounced the Treaty of Wuchale candidly as a fraud perpetrated by Italy. How he asked, could anyone even dream of, quote, conquering such an extent of land with a tradition of independence that reached back centuries? Ilg also prepared Europe for Ethiopian victory. He was keen to tell the people of Italy that their leaders wouldn't tell them, namely that their young men were at risk. Ethiopia's military advantage was so clear that Ilg could see no point in concealing Menelik's plans. Menelik had no intention of breaking his army on the walls of Adigrat. Menelik would deny Italy the classic colonial military encounter it wanted. Adigrat's vulnerability was strategic, Ilg noted. It didn't need to be taken by force. He depicted Adigrat as a meaningless fortress, dangling at the end of precarious link to the coast. Provisioning troops is already very difficult, Ilg noted. Everything has to come from Mazawa. Menelik would simply ignore Adigrat, push past it, and threaten Eritrea. Such a move would isolate Adigrat, turning it into another Mekelle. Besieged, starving, helpless, Adigrat would be cut off and left to die. Ilg didn't seek to deny Ethiopian vulnerabilities, especially the quarreling in the Ethiopian court. Yes, there were jealousies, even rivalries, but Ethiopia had overcome these rivalries, and it owed it all to Italy. It's like two dogs fighting over a bone. If a hyena arrives and tries to join the fight, the dogs unite against him. By laying out the strength of the Ethiopian position, Ilg was trying to build pressure for a negotiated settlement. It would be far better for both sides if combat could be avoided. But if a showdown couldn't be avoided, if fighting ensued and lives were lost, at least Ethiopia occupied the moral high ground, defending itself and its sovereignty. Finally, Ilg appealed to the sympathy of Europeans, asking them to identify themselves with Ethiopia and the Ethiopians. No European nation could submit to Abyssinian rule, he stated, inviting his readers to supply the corollary that Abyssinia would never submit to Ethiopian rule. Colonial warfare in the 19th century was governed by a few simple principles, and by the 1890s, these were known by both sides. Numerical superiority always gave an advantage on the battlefield. European colonial armies tended to be small, while African armies could easily overwhelm them in numbers. Advantage Africa. But that assumed that the soldiers being counted were equivalent in other ways. What the Europeans lacked in numbers, they compensated for elsewhere, in firepower and in discipline. Advantage Europe. It was as if Menelik, in preparing the defense of Ethiopia, had taken the checklist of European military advantages and crossed them off one by one. If the Ethiopians lacked the training and discipline of European armies, they were nevertheless far from being raw recruits. They lacked the snappy uniforms of the European soldiers. Warfare for the Ethiopians was strictly a come-as-you-are affair, but they had enough experience and training to avoid foolish mistakes in combat. Menelik's campaign against the Walaita, followed by the victories of Ambalage and Mekelle, had turned his army into a competent, battle-hardened force. The Ethiopian army was also better organized than in previous campaigns. Baratieri was among the first to admit it. When he was pressed by the Italian government to explain why he hadn't attacked Minilik as the Ethiopians moved northward toward Eritrea, Baratieri snapped back testily, "There is a great disproportion in the size of our forces. The enemy is shrewd and his organization has greatly improved since 1888, when Johannes had led a large Ethiopian force into Eritrea only to turn back, obliging us to exercise maximum prudence in order to take advantage of any error. Nor were they necessarily at a disadvantage with respect to arms and firepower. Menelik had been careful not to concede the high ground of military technology to the Italians. The soldiers Johannes had marched into Eritrea carried ancient muzzle loaders. Many of Menelik's soldiers had breech loaders. Baratieri's European infantrymen were issued magazine-fed repeating rifles for the most part. The Askari recruits, however, were given hand-me-down rifles, no longer adequate for combat in Europe but deemed good enough for colonial warfare. These were no better than, and sometimes inferior to, the rifles carried by Menelik's soldiers. Menelik's French-made Hotchkiss artillery pieces, properly operated, were superior to the mountain guns fired by Baratieri's European and Askari batteries. Another critical variable was position. Menelik had refused to give the Italians battle where they most wanted it, at Adigrat, where Menelik's thousands would bloody themselves storming the walls of the fortress. Instead, he skirted Adigrat, moving west and to the north, a play that threatened not only Baratieri's lines of communication, but also the colony of Eritrea itself. This left Baratieri with a difficult choice. He could abandon Adigrat and withdraw into Eritrea. This would shorten his supply lines and keep his army between Menelik and Eritrea, but this would not mean evacuating the land seized following the defeat of Mangasha the previous year. It was tantamount to conceding defeat. The alternative was to leave a defensive contingent in Adigrat while moving his main forces westward in pursuit of Menelik. On February 1st, just 2 days after Galliano's troops had rejoined him, Baratieri occupied the Alegua Pass, about 10 miles west of Adigrat, on the road to Adwa. As Menelik continued his westward move away from Baratieri and Adigrat, Baratieri followed, advancing another 15 miles. 2 days later, on the 3rd of February, Baratieri set up camp near Enticho at a place called Saria. On the 5th, Menelik sent word that he had established his headquarters at Gundapta, where he would await peace overtures. Thus, by early February 1896, Ethiopian and Italian forces had positioned themselves halfway between Adigrat and Aksum. Terrain in this part of Ethiopia can be varied and complex, but the landscape between Menelik's camp at Gundapta and Baratieri's camp at Enticho is mostly flat. It is a high plain 2 miles wide from north to south and at least 5 miles wide east to west. The plain is bounded by hills, creating a high-altitude elliptical bowl. Ethiopian and Italian forces faced off across the vast expanse. Menelik spread out his army at the western edge of the bowl, on the fields and hillsides of the Gundapta plain. If the Italians advanced on him, he would have plenty of room to deploy his forces. For Baratieri, it was just the opposite. Moving his forces across the bowl into the open field would expose his flanks and play into the envelopment strategies the Ethiopians preferred. He needed a confined space where he could deploy his troops with their disciplined artillery and rifle fire to maximum advantage. He established his camp on slopes on the eastern edge of the bowl, Backed up against high ground, looking west toward Minilik, it was a natural fortress, a field cut by 5 or 6 mountains that guarded in place of towers. He immediately set his forces to work digging trenches and constructing fortified positions. If the Ethiopians attacked, his towers would funnel them towards his artillery and entrenched soldiers. Baratieri fully understood the risks entailed in attacking Minilik at Gundapta. He summarized the standoff in a note to Rome. The enemy occupies a strong position between Intosho and Gundapta, 5 hours from our camp. Our position is strong, but intricate terrain makes advancing difficult without exposing our flanks. And so stalemate ensued. Menelik no more wanted to attack the Italians in their entrenched position at Saria than Baratieri wanted to engage Ethiopian forces in the wide valley in front of Gundapta. Peace negotiations began half-heartedly and broke down within a week. Then a sudden betrayal decisively shifted the balance in Ethiopia's favor. The end of divide and conquer. The defection of Ras Sabhat and Hagos Teferi. Baratieri had reason to believe that time was on his side. Troops called up after AMBW were on steamships making their way across the Mediterranean to Eritrea. Thousands were disembarking at Massawa each week. In the last 10 days of January alone, 6 vessels, the Singapore, the Adria, the Gotardo, the Washington, the Rubatino, and the Mingeti, landed at Massawa. They disgorged almost 4,000 soldiers and officers. In February, vessels were leaving Naples at a rate of nearly 1 a day, bringing thousands more. But the Italian position had its challenges too. Feeding tens of thousands of men in the Ethiopian highlands was no joke. Much of what was needed could not be found locally, not in Asmara, not even in Massawa. At times, meat on the hoof was brought in from India on contract. Virtually everything else had to be brought in from Italy. Getting it to Massawa was just the beginning. From Massawa, supplies had to be moved first by narrow gauge rail most of the way to Asmara and then by caravan to Adigrat. The ascent from Massawa to Adigrat took a week under optimal conditions. Along the way, caravans were delayed. When pack animals pulled up lame, there were bandit raids. The difficulty of it all is conveyed in the litany of places through which the supplies moved, a list almost as long as the route itself. Massawa, Ilaila, Mahio, Adi Kai, Sanafe, Barakit, Adiguden, Adigrat. And Menelik's army was not the only one vulnerable to defections. Baratieris relied on important native allies, Hagos Teferi and Ras Sabahat, whose allegiance was conditional and held a nasty surprise for Baratieri. Hagos Teferi and Ras Sabahat had joined the cause of Italy and Eritrea after a fallout with Mangasha in 1895. The men were rivals. They came from families that historically ruled in Agame, a region north of Tigray. When Mangasha needed to appoint a new ruler in Agame, rather than choose between them, he chose neither. This might have been the end of it, but in the rough and tumble world of Tigrayan politics, Mangasha also sought pacification. He invited the defeated rivals to visit him at Adwa. Hagos Teferi, smelling a trap, decided to stay away. Ras Sabat accepted Mangasha's invitation and was magnificently received. Midway through the festivities, Sabat was seized, tied up, and hauled away. Mangasha had him imprisoned in a remote hilltop called AMBW. He would remain a prisoner of Mangasha until released by the Italians in October 1895. Mangasha's high-handedness earned him Hagos Teferi's eternal enmity. It also brought Italy a valued ally, at least for a time. Hagos Teferi joined the Italians, fought Mangasha alongside them, and shared in the booty after the victories of 1895. After the defeat of Mangasha at Sanafe, Hagostafari hauled away weapons, animals, women, and treasure from the rubble of Mangasha's camp. Weeks later, Ras Sapat also joined the Italians when they drove off Mangasha, setting him free. Thus, by late 1895, both men were allies of Italy. Winning over Sapat and Hagostafari had been a brilliant move. It was a perfect execution of Italy's strategy of divide and conquer. By cultivating the support of Mangasha's disgruntled lieutenants, Baratieri could weaken Mangasha while adding to the forces at his disposal. Moreover, these forces knew the terrain and the enemy intimately. Baratieri thought the relationship would hold. In his dispatches to Rome, Baratieri referred to Hagostafari as our friend. But Hagostafari was an opportunist, not a traitor. His loyalty lasted only as long as the illusion of Italian inevitability did. By the middle of February 1896, after Ambalage and Magale, it was clear that Menelik had taken the initiative. Baratieri was playing defense. Reacting to Menelik's moves, Hagostafari and Sabat could see how the coming conflict was going to turn out. As one of Ras Sabat's soldiers bluntly put it, the Italians were weak, while Menelik was strong. Around 11 o'clock in the evening on February 13, Hagostafari, Ras Sabat, and their men quietly picked up their things, including Italian-issued firearms, and left the Italian camp, leaving behind mules, provisions, and tents. Baratieri was stunned. He thought their move made no sense, and he said so in telegrams back to Rome. Mangasha is their enemy. He protested he gave control of these lands to others. Baratieri missed the point. The defection of Hagostafari and Ras Sapat was not about Mangasha. It represented a sober assessment of the balance of forces in the coming conflict. If Baratieri had been paying attention, he would have understood what it meant. Menelik and Ethiopia were going to win. When they arrived at Menelik's camp, the erstwhile traitors Hagostafari and Ras Sabat were greeted as honored heroes. And when the news reached Adigrat, Agame's main city and linchpin of the Italian occupation, the people celebrated spontaneously and shamelessly. The Italian occupation crumbles. The defection of Hagos, Tafari, and Sapat represented a loss of 500 men. Not much in the great scheme of things, but what it pretended was much more, including interruptions in communications, disrupted supply lines, and Agame in revolt. The departure of Hagos Tafari and Ras Sapat threatened Italian morale as it rallied the broader population. If, for a time, the Italians had deceived themselves into thinking that their presence was welcome, they could no longer. Even Baratieri had conceded that within days of their defection, Ras Sapat and Hagos Tafari had tripled the size of their forces, thanks to volunteers from the surrounding population eager to join a burgeoning resistance. With Menelik's encouragement, Ras Sapat and Hagos Tafari wasted no time in putting their new recruits to work. Hagos Tafari and Sapat knew the disposition of Italian forces intimately. Baratieri's telegraph communication with the rear was cut, then restored, then lost again. On the 18th, only 5 days after they had left Baratieri's camp, the forces of Hagos Tafari and Sapat were threatening the town of Barakit, a strategic position along Baratieri's supply lines, 33 miles to the rear. Italian troops escorting a supply caravan were attacked at Mai Marat, a point midway between Baratieri and the rear supply position of Barakit. Forays out of Adigrat or the encampment of Saria frequently led to disaster. They were often accompanied by the atrocities that insurgency can bring. A reconnaissance mission of 110 soldiers was ambushed and badly shot up on February 14th. That night, a rescue mission of 35 men set out. They were intercepted and massacred. The bodies of the dead were stripped. On February 16th, insurgents loyal to Menelik occupied the high ground around the town of Adigrat. When a contingent of 100 Italian soldiers set out to greet a large caravan coming up from Asmera, they were set upon by forces greatly outnumbering them. The soldiers retreated toward Adigrat, leaving behind many dead and several prisoners, including 2 commanding officers. The Ethiopians seized the uniforms and the dead and the captured. The following day, they wore those captured uniforms as a part of a ruse to lure a rescue force of 140 men into an ambush. There were also reports of mistreatments of captured soldiers, wounded soldiers burned alive, and the disfiguring of the bodies of the dead. Reports that troubled soldiers and undermined morale. While Baratieri at Saria was contemplating attack or retreat in terms of conventional warfare, on the roads leading to and from Adigrat, one could make out the unmistakable signs of an incipient guerrilla war. Baratieri considered shifting his supply lines away from Adigrat to a road that ran by way of Mai Marat and Debra Damo. By the revolt initiated by the departures of Hagos Tafari and Ras Sapat, included the entire Agame region, and the high ground near the monastery of Debra Damo provided a hospitable refuge for the insurgents. The Italians, who once claimed to have arrived to liberate the local inhabitants from Mangasha's arbitrary and divisive rule, were now facing a civilian insurrection actively supporting Menelik's defense of Ethiopia. Troops loyal to Ethiopia harried caravans between Adigrat to Saria. They watched as Italian soldiers, wary of ambush and with fixed bayonets, made their way along narrow paths. Supply convoy details, understandably eager to bring the ordeal to an end, pushed pack animals to the limit. But when fatigue set in, they had to stop, sometimes hourly, to unburden the animals and allow them to rest. Some of the animals, utterly spent, could simply fall to the ground and die. Campfires became part of an elaborate game of disinformation as Ethiopians and Italians sought to exaggerate numbers. At night, the campfires of the Ethiopian troops flickered from the surrounding hilltops. Luigi Gorge's convoy built extra campfires to create the illusion of a large force and thus discourage attack. Convoys sometimes traveled at night in the hope of avoiding detection, but it left them prey to the fear of an enemy they couldn't see, concealed by darkness. Sometimes the soldiers couldn't help giving away their presence. The passes were so dangerous at night that the soldiers would set fire to dried shrubs, creating a small bonfire to light their way. Ethiopian scouts were witness to the eerie spectacle of soldiers and animals passing the flames one by one, their shadows bobbing and leaping against the mountain face. Soon the precarious situation began to have a bearing on supplies. Rations of flour, canned meat, and coffee continued, but there was no more wine, rum, salt, or sugar. By the third week of February, soldiers were receiving flour, biscuits, and meat only every other day. Things were no better for the askari. On the 26th, barley, what they considered to be animal fodder, was distributed to the askari in place of wheat. Hunger became a factor. Carlo Diotti, a corporal in the kitchen detail, witnessed fellow soldiers buying food from the askari. For the askari, it was a profit opportunity. For the Italians, it was a way of staving off hunger. Shortages had an impact on discipline. Luigi Gorge saw soldiers break into food stocks. They stole a sack of flour and a case of biscuits, while a sympathetic sentry looked the other way. The shortage of food began to manifest itself in other ways. Soldiers began to grumble. Some left jackets unbuttoned, stopped shaving, and went shirtless. Some still looked like soldiers, others resembled bandits. Baratieri's army was coming apart. Menelik had won. He had shown Baratieri and Italy that the victories over Mangasha and the prior year were hollow. Power exists only when it can be defended. By marching unimpeded as far as Tigray, Menelik had demonstrated the emptiness of Italian rule. Political leadership in Rome seemed to appreciate the gravity of the situation more acutely than Baratieri himself. The telegraph line crackled with notes of concern. Sabhat and Hagos occupied the mountains surrounding Adigrat and incite rebellion in Agame. Baratieri wrote to Stanislaw Moseni, the Minister of War, on February 18th, without specifying what he intended to do about it. Ministry occupied with the consequences of rebellion. Preoccupied with consequences of rebellion, replied Moseni in spare telegraphic language, and invites Your Excellency Baratieri to communicate your views on the present situation. The ministry had decided to give you any other reinforcements necessary. Moseni was anxious about the strategic situation of Italian forces. Since the beginning of the year, he had been shipping out battalions even in advance of Baratieri's request. Meanwhile, Moseni was doing battle with Sidney Sonnino, the Minister of Treasury, who wanted assurance that Baratieri's operations wouldn't break the bank. Would the campaign shatter the government's budgets? Sonnino asked. Not if operations lasted only a month, responded Moseni. Italy needed a victory, and it needed it soon.